I showed up unexpectedly at my wife's lover's house, and when she opened the door and saw me, she couldn't believe it. She turned pale, unable to say a word. I placed the ring in her palm and simply said, "Now you have a clear path." I turned my back and walked away, with the weight of the end and the lightness of not keeping quiet. It was the sound of my own heart breaking silently, a dry crack inside my chest, but at the same time, a cruel liberation, because as much as it hurt, the worst pain was continuing to pretend I didn't know, that I didn't see the signs, that I didn't feel each lie growing like a thorn between us. The path to that door was the longest of my life. Not because of the journey, but because of the certainty that after her, there would be no more us. What remained was the echo of broken trust and the memory of the nights she told me she loved me while longing for someone else. I didn't want to fight. I didn't want to scream. I didn't seek explanations. I'd already lost everything when I felt her gaze was no longer just mine. When the kiss became protocol. When the cell phone became a secret. When she started smiling alone at messages I didn't send. The lover, a face I only knew in glimpses and silences. I didn't know his name, but I knew the touch, the smell, the space he stole from me without asking permission. He invaded my home with her eyes. He entered my life through the smile she'd come to cherish. And even without knowing me, he destroyed everything I'd spent years building with love, patience, and dedication. That night, she didn't have the heart to stop me. She stood there, at the door, her hand trembling, clutching the ring as if holding on to her last breath. But I had already died inside long ago. All that was left was to bury it. And I buried it at that exact moment, when I turned my back and didn't look back. Every step away from her was a step closer to myself. To my dignity. To the self-respect she tried to slowly kill, with every empty excuse, every fabricated absence, every distracted kiss. I didn't need proof, I needed peace. And in that moment, I understood that sometimes, forgiveness isn't a comeback. It's a classy full stop. The weeks that followed were filled with silence, internal reconciliation, and questions she never asked me. I didn't know it right away, but her lover disappeared as soon as he felt the weight of responsibility knock on his door. When she was free to experience her great love, he simply vanished. Blocked. Ignored. Escaped as if he never intended to stay. And then, for the first time, perhaps, she understood that what she called passion was just vanity being fed. I was the presence, he was the desire. But presence is the one who holds your hand on bad days. It's the one who listens, who welcomes, who stays. Desire disappears when the light of day appears. She tried to contact me, of course. She looked for me on social media, through mutual friends, and sent long messages that began with, "I'm sorry," and ended with, "I still love you." There was one that destroyed me inside, I confess. It said, "I only realized what I had when I lost it. You were home. He was just a hotel room." I read it. And I cried. But I didn't respond. Because as much as my heart still yearned, my soul had already learned to live without pain. And I wasn't going to throw myself back into the abyss I'd fought so hard to escape. That's when I found someone. Someone who didn't carry the weight of the past, who looked at me truthfully, who held no secrets in their eyes. A sincere hug, a heartfelt laugh. I didn't need to prove myself, or defend myself. For the first time in a long time, I was just me, and that was enough. This person taught me that love doesn't need to be begged for. That trust shouldn't be a battle. That reciprocity isn't a luxury. It was all I'd ever given, and now, finally, I was receiving it back. And in this new beginning, I realized that true love is only valuable when it's a mutual, daily, and respectful choice. She knew. Someone told her. And when we met by chance, she saw me beside this new woman. I saw in her eyes the mirror of what I once was, someone full of questions, searching in the other for an answer that only time can provide. She cried. She tried to say something, but her voice broke. I just smiled. Not out of cruelty, but out of peace. And I said, I forgive you, but I'm not coming back. Because forgiving is letting go, not rescuing. Forgiving is saying goodbye without anger, it's wishing well without wanting to return. I thought that would be the end of our story. But months later, something unexpected happened. She showed up at a wedding, alone, at the back of the church, while everyone stared at the altar. No one really noticed her. I wasn't there. It was the wedding of mutual friends. She watched everything in silence, her eyes welling up. During the vows, when the bride spoke about trust, loyalty, and choices, she broke down. She cried like someone who understands too late. Like someone who no longer belongs anywhere. She sat in the last pew, with an invisible veil of regret and longing. She watched another love being celebrated, while her own had been buried by her own hands. She never had the courage to look for me after that. But I knew she kept that ring. Not as a souvenir, but as a symbol of what never returns. Of what cannot be rebuilt. And now she lives with the bitter certainty that, by choosing the fire of passion, she burned the bridge that led back home. But what she never knew, is that I also kept something of hers. Not an object. But a letter she wrote a week before the betrayal, in which she said she loved me more than anything, and that I was the man of her life. And perhaps that's the cruelest irony of all, betrayal didn't kill love. She simply abandoned it on impulse. And when she tried to return, it was too late. But this story still has something no one saw. A detail. A truth that was never told. Because, that night I left and she stood at the door with the ring in her hand, she wasn't alone. And what happened minutes after I left, could change everything you think about this story. Welcome to the channel. Here, no form of betrayal is romanticized or condoned, on the contrary, our stories show, with intensity and realism, how betrayal can destroy lives, homes, and true loves. The narratives are fictional, but the feelings are real. Prepare to immerse yourself in a gripping, painful, and unforgettable story. Take a deep breath, and hold on. Because what you're about to hear is simply, shocking. She always said she didn't believe in coincidences. That everything in life had a reason, a time, a greater meaning. And perhaps it was this almost poetic vision of the world that made Helena such a magnetic woman. There was something about her that escaped words, something between the lightness of her smile and the intensity of her gaze, as if time stopped for a second whenever she entered a room. But her beauty was never what drew the most attention. It was the way she listened with her whole body, as if absorbing every word spoken with her soul, and the way she transformed small routines into something almost cinematic. With her, even a late afternoon coffee smelled like a memory. He, Daniel, was made of silence and presence. A man who didn't say much, but said everything with his gaze. Hardworking, loyal, possessed of a rare calm that contrasted with the hurried world they lived in. When they met, it was precisely this difference that united them. While she was the hurricane, he was the shelter. While she ran, he waited. She was intensity, he was constancy. And in that unbalanced balance between extremes, a beautiful, solid, and, in everyone's eyes, indestructible love was born. Their relationship grew slowly, in no rush to turn everything around all at once. In the beginning, they both came from broken backgrounds. Helena carried old wounds from an abusive relationship, and Daniel was still grieving the loss of his mother, who had been his greatest support. They met amidst ruins and decided to rebuild together, patiently. Helena learned to trust again, step by step, in Daniel's sincere eyes. And he rediscovered what it was like to be cared for in her gentle hands. They lived in a simple house, but full of details that only true love provides, her plants on the porch, his books stacked in the corner of the living room, the paintings they chose together, the mugs exchanged on birthdays. Everything breathed their presence. Close friends commented on the almost intuitive connection between them. It was as if a single look was enough for them to understand each other. And, for a time, that was truly the case. Daniel worked as a history teacher at a public school. He loved what he did. He was the kind of professional who wasn't content with just teaching, he inspired. Students sought him out even after graduation, just to say thank you. He took pride in his work, even without much recognition. For him, teaching was more than a job, it was a mission. Helena, on the other hand, had a degree in communications and had recently started working at a cultural center. She loved art, books, and music. She had a keen sensitivity and a special gift for interacting with people. She was captivated by stories, by details, by anything with a soul. When she talked about a film she'd seen or a book she'd read, her eyes would sparkle. Daniel loved to listen, even when he didn't understand half the references. He listened because it was her. And that was enough. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Helena hosted a small celebration at home, with a few friends and family. It was a light evening, filled with laughter, soft music, and exchanged glances. Daniel, more reserved, spent most of the time watching Helena move among the guests, smiling with that freedom only those at peace can possess. And there, sitting on the sofa with a glass of wine in hand, he felt a wave of silent gratitude. He had the woman he loved, a peaceful and, though simple, yet fulfilling life. That night, Helena gave a quick speech, without much rehearsal. She said that, with Daniel, she had learned that love wasn't about momentary intensity, but about daily choice. That, even on difficult days, he was there. Always was. His eyes filled with tears. It was perhaps the first time she had seen Daniel visibly moved in public. He held her hand tightly, as if confirming a pact. And there, once again, they promised to continue choosing each other. Routine, as in any marriage, followed the enchantment. And, little by little, the rush began to take over the spaces that once belonged to spontaneity. Daniel would leave early and return tired. Helena, now more involved with work, also spent hours away. Conversations diminished in depth. Quality time became scarce. But still, there was respect. There was affection. Small daily gestures, like making coffee for each other or leaving notes hidden in books, persisted. Because love, as they always said, was what was made between the lines. On Sundays, they still cooked together. It was their ritual. They chose strange recipes that rarely turned out well, but the shared laughter always made up for it. In those moments, the old sparkle returned to Helena's eyes, and Daniel seemed less world-weary. She began to get involved with new projects at the cultural center. Many events, exhibitions, launch dinners. She met new people, made new friends, and moved into places Daniel didn't frequent. Not for lack of desire, but because she felt out of place. Helena said he was a fish out of water at these events, and he laughed, a little embarrassed, as if accepting a truth. He didn't complain, he'd never been one to demand attendance. But inside, I was beginning to feel a distance I couldn't quite name. Helena would sometimes arrive late, talking excitedly about the people she met, the artists, the debates. Daniel listened attentively, even as a tinge of unease began to grow within him. It was as if, little by little, she was experiencing a part of life he could no longer reach. The changes were subtle. Nothing abrupt. Nothing that said, "Here begins the fall." But they were there. In the distracted glances. In the prolonged silences. In the less lingering hugs. She still told him she loved him, he still believed her. But love sometimes hides behind habit. Daniel, for his part, began to dedicate himself more to work. He took on more classes, more school projects. Perhaps unconsciously, he sought to fill a void he hadn't yet realized existed. Helena, on the other hand, immersed herself deeper and deeper in that new world. She was praised, admired, recognized. She felt alive in a different way. Not better, not worse. Just different. And this different was new. And new is sometimes confusing. One night, after a quiet dinner, they sat on the porch. She with a glass of wine, he with a book on his lap. The silence between them was comfortable but fraught. Daniel asked, out of the blue, if she was happy. She took a while to answer. She said yes, that she was grateful, that she knew how much they had built together. But her response was dull. He noticed. But he didn't comment. He just smiled, forced, and returned to his book. Something there broke a little more. Not by the answer, but by the lack of truth in her gaze. In the following months, Helena started going out more. Events, get-togethers, coffees with colleagues. Daniel, always understanding, never questioned it. But deep down, she was beginning to feel the weight of absence. It wasn't jealousy. It was loneliness for two. The worst kind. That feeling of being accompanied, yet invisible. He tried to change it. He planned short trips, dinners. She agreed, but with rehearsed enthusiasm. The distance that had previously been merely emotional began to become physical as well. They slept at different times, talked less and less about feelings. Even their Sunday rituals began to falter. The go-to recipe became app-based food. Laughter, silence. And silence, discomfort. Still, he insisted. Because he believed it was all a phase. That real marriages also face dry spells. That love doesn't die, it just hides. And that all it took was patience, dedication, and surrender. He was willing. But love needs to be a choice between two people. And there was something in Helena that no longer chose. She tried. At times, she still found herself moved when looking at old photos, notes, memories. But the connection that united them was fragmented. And although there was still affection, her presence was no longer whole. Pieces were missing. And Daniel felt it. He knew it. He just didn't want to admit it. Time passed. The seasons changed. Birthdays came and went with quick hugs. Friends began to notice the distance, but no one said anything. Because everything seemed fine. Helena smiled in photos. Daniel posted quotes about gratitude. But what was seen on social media was merely an edited version of reality. Inside the house, two people who had once been everything to each other were now almost strangers sharing the same roof. And then came the turning point. A gesture. A detail. A discovery that wasn't sought, but fell on our lap like an open wound. And from that moment on, nothing would be the same again. But that's a story for the next chapter. Daniel started waking up before his alarm. His eyes stared open at the ceiling, his chest heavy with a restlessness he couldn't yet explain. Helena, beside him, slept soundly, her face serene against the pillow, as if nothing were out of place. He watched for a few seconds before getting up, almost guiltily, as if spying on her tranquility were a personal offense. He showered in silence, made coffee as always, but now there was a slowness in his gestures, an absence of expectation. It was as if time had begun to function on a different frequency inside that house, denser, colder, as if the minutes dragged by between walls that no longer bore witness to affection. The sound of the blender, the clinking of spoons, the footsteps through the living room, everything seemed to echo differently, emptier. Helena came downstairs a few minutes later, always in a hurry, phone in hand, notifications highlighted, smiles trapped between quick replies. She said good morning in her usual sweet voice, but her eyes no longer sought him. And when he tried to touch her affectionately, her gestures came too quickly, like someone who needs to run so as not to be late for another life. During the day, Daniel focused on his work. Or tried to. It was hard to teach about ancient wars when, inside him, a much more intimate battle seemed about to erupt. He began to get distracted, forget appointments, lose the rhythm that had always defined him. He didn't tell anyone, but something in him already sensed it. It wasn't a concrete suspicion. It was a feeling. An intuition. The kind that grows silently and screams without warning. He began to notice small signs. Helena no longer left her cell phone on the table, as she used to. She even took it with her to the bathroom, slept with it face down, always on silent mode. The laughter she once shared with him now came alone, accompanied by messages she typed hurriedly, with a gleam in her eyes he no longer saw when he looked directly at her. When he tried to approach her, she changed the subject or blurted out generic phrases about work, projects, life. On a typical Wednesday, Helena arrived later than usual. She said the event at the cultural center had run long, that the guests were excited, that it was important for her career to be there, to network, to keep the momentum going. Daniel believed her. Or at least he wanted to believe her. But that night, she was different. Her makeup was slightly smudged, her eyes shining not with fatigue, but with euphoria. A kind of excitement that didn't come from a job well done, but from something else. Something pulsing beneath her skin. He watched her as she took off her shoes and flopped onto the sofa with a long sigh. She asked if he'd had dinner, and he said yes. There was no hunger in that house. Not for food, not for affection. The following days followed a subtly torturous pattern. Helena went out more, spoke less, laughed to herself with her cell phone, hugged mechanically. Daniel, in turn, withdrew. Not out of fear, but out of respect for a distance that could no longer be ignored. He began spending more time away, staying at school even after work, just to avoid coming home so early. He stopped making coffee for both of them. He started making only his own. Small, silent acts of revenge, which only he noticed. One Friday, he decided to call her in the middle of work, something he never did. He just wanted to hear her voice, as if something inside him begged for confirmation that there was still some connection. She answered after the third ring, her voice dry, quick, uncomfortable. She said she was in a meeting. He hung up quickly, feeling like an intruder. That night, she said she'd go to bed early. She was exhausted. But she spent over an hour in the bathroom with her cell phone, locked away, laughing softly. He listened. And at that moment, what was once an intuition became a nameless certainty. On Saturday, Helena said she had a meeting with her work colleagues. Daniel didn't ask any questions. He just nodded. But this time, something made him get up from the couch a few minutes after she left. He put on a jacket, grabbed his car keys, and left. He didn't know exactly where he was going. He just went. Like someone following a scent, a clue, a pain. He drove through the streets with his eyes alert, his mind racing. He passed the cultural center, looked at the lights on, but didn't stop. He drove for another 20 minutes until, in a discreet corner of the city, he recognized Helena's car parked in front of a residential building. His heart beat faster, his hands sweating, but he didn't get out of the car. He just stood there, watching. The clock read 9:20 p.m. He stayed for over an hour, silent, his eyes fixed on the third-floor window, where the lights were on. He didn't need confirmation. He already knew. But it wasn't that night that he acted. He returned home without saying anything. He slept little. Or pretended to sleep. Sunday arrived with the same false calm as all the others. She made pancakes, talked about a new project, and asked if he wanted to go to the movies that night. He declined. He said he had to grade papers. She didn't insist. The silence between them was no longer awkward. It was normal. Over the following week, Daniel began to notice more. Details. Smells. Routines. On 2 separate days, he saw messages with heart emojis on her phone, quickly deleted when he approached. On the third day, she came home with wet hair, even though she'd said she'd come straight from work. On Thursday, she saw from afar a man drop her off on the street corner and head in the opposite direction. Helena came home saying she'd taken a ride-hailing service. He didn't respond. He just smiled. And he decided it was time. The following Friday, she went out again. She said it would be an important night, with lots of guests, and that she might be late. Daniel kissed her forehead, said goodnight, and stayed home. He waited about 40 minutes, then grabbed his keys and left. He drove to the same building. He parked, got out, and entered the building as if he were a resident. The doorman didn't even question him. He climbed the 3 flights of stairs, stopped in front of the door, and waited a few seconds. He took a deep breath. He knocked. It took about 15 seconds. Just enough time to hear hurried footsteps, a muffled voice inside the apartment, and finally, the sound of the doorknob turning. The door opened. And there she was. Helena. Her hair tied back, her face expressionless, her clothes too casual for a smart event. When she saw him, her body froze. Her eyes widened. Her mouth hung open. She was speechless. Daniel, without saying a word, extended his hand, the ring between his fingers. His palm open. His eyes steady. She didn't react. She just let a tear fall. He spoke softly, without anger, only with a pain that overflowed with dignity. Now you have a clear path. And then he turned and left. He walked slowly down the stairs, feeling the sound of his own footsteps echo inside his chest like the beating of a shattered heart. When he got to the car, he didn't cry. He just breathed. For the first time in a long time, he took a deep breath. The weight of doubt had lifted. Now there was only silence, and a bitter certainty. He went home and slept as if he no longer expected anything. The next day, Helena didn't return. And for the first time in years, he didn't miss her. Throughout the week, the messages, the calls, the requests to talk came. He ignored them all. Not out of revenge, but out of respect for what he was no longer. The part of him that belonged to that love had died at that door. But what Daniel didn't yet know, was that this betrayal carried a hidden detail. A silent truth that Helena never had the courage to tell. And that, when it came to light, would forever change the meaning of everything he thought about what they had experienced. 2 months had passed since Daniel and Helena had last exchanged words. There had been no formal goodbye, no final discussions. Just a dense, absolute silence that replaced any explanation. She tried. She wrote long messages, some almost poetic, others desperate. She called at random times, left choked voicemails, went to the door of their old house twice. But he didn't answer. He didn't even come out. He wasn't the same man anymore, and she seemed to know it. Daniel, for his part, filled his days with a new stillness, almost apathetic, but real. He started running in the mornings, adopted a dog, started visiting his parents more often, and even began to indulge in small talk with a schoolmate who shared his love of literature. It wasn't love yet, but it was presence. And after so much abandonment, any sincere presence was a new beginning. It was a Saturday afternoon when something happened. The sun was beginning to set on the horizon, and Daniel was at home, making himself a coffee when he heard a knock on the door. 3 short knocks, a space, and 2 more. It wasn't a delivery. It wasn't a neighbor. And before he even opened it, he knew. He took a deep breath and turned the doorknob with the slowness of someone facing a ghost. Helena was there. Her hair loose, her clothes simple, her eyes sunken and bloodshot. She didn't look like she'd slept well. Her expression was a mixture of guilt, exhaustion, and an urgent need to say something. He said nothing. He just leaned against the door, arms crossed, waiting. She asked if she could come in. He hesitated, but then made way. She entered silently, looking around with a look that mixed longing and regret, like someone recognizing a place they no longer belonged to. She sat on the sofa without asking and ran her nervous hands over her knees. Daniel stood, leaning against the wall. She looked up, hesitant, and said she needed to tell him something. That it was important. That I couldn't carry it alone anymore. Daniel crossed his arms. He waited. And then she began. Her voice trembled, her eyes welled up, but there was no hesitation. She said she wasn't there to justify anything. She knew the harm she had caused, how much she had destroyed something that had taken years to build. But there was something he didn't know. Something that, if she didn't say, he would never have the courage to say again. And even if nothing changed, she needed him to hear it. Helena swallowed hard, looked at the floor, and blurted out the sentence as if dropping a bomb: the man she had cheated on him with, was married. Daniel stood still for a few seconds. His face didn't change, but his eyes did. As if something had been triggered inside. She continued. She said she didn't know at first. That she met him at one of the events, that he was charming, attentive, that he seemed to understand everything she said. That he made her laugh, that he looked at her in a way she felt she'd lost. But that, at first, she believed it was just a connection of ideas, of conversation, of admiration. Until the day they crossed an invisible line. She said she wasn't proud of any of it. That she knew what she was risking. But that, somewhere between the loneliness she felt and the desire to feel alive again, she let herself be carried away. Daniel remained silent. His silence was crueler than any answer. She then explained that, upon discovering he was married, she was already involved. And what was supposed to be a one-time thing became a habit. An addiction. And that she'd fooled herself into thinking she could control it. But that wasn't the secret. The secret wasn't that he was married. The secret was who his wife was. Helena closed her eyes for a second, as if her body needed to gather strength. And then she said, the woman betrayed by that man, was her childhood friend. Not a distant acquaintance. A true friend. The kind who grew up together, who kept notes from school, who cried together on difficult nights. A friend who was there for her when no one else was. Who held her when Helena had panic attacks as a teenager. Who helped with her wedding dress. Who cried with emotion when she saw her at the altar with Daniel. That friend. That woman. Daniel blinked in surprise. He released his arms. He straightened. It still hadn't sunk in. Helena explained that her friend never knew. That her husband hid everything. That she herself thought she was living a secret life, just theirs. But one day, when she saw a photo on Instagram, she recognized the woman. It took you a while to believe it. But it was her. And there, everything that seemed liberating turned rotten. And yet, she continued. She continued because she no longer knew how to stop. Because she was trapped between regret and desire, between shame and illusion. Daniel approached slowly, sat on the other sofa, facing her. His eyes fixed on hers. He asked calmly, why? Helena broke down. He said he felt invisible. That, as much as he knew Daniel loved her, he missed being desired, admired, teased. That he'd let himself be carried away by a silly compliment, by untimely attention. And that, deep down, he didn't know if it was for him or for herself that she'd done it. But after losing Daniel, she realized that what she sought in another's arms was merely a reflection of what she already had and could no longer see. She said she tried to contact her friend, but hadn't had the courage to tell her. That he'd been a coward twice. That he'd lost two people he loved because of a rash decision. Daniel closed his eyes. He took a deep breath. Inside, everything was spinning. It wasn't just about betrayal now. It was about values. About the kind of person she had become. About the chasm between who she was and who he had once loved. And yet, something in him felt sorry. Not for her. But for what she had lost. For the person she had stopped being. He stood up slowly. He said he had listened to all of this not out of curiosity, but out of respect for what they had experienced. That, in that moment, he understood that she hadn't betrayed him for lack of love. But for lack of self. That she had lost herself, and along the way, dragged everything with her. He said there was no longer anger, only immense weariness. A void where love once lived. That betrayal does destroy. But it's not love that kills. It's admiration. And without admiration, love becomes a burden. Helena wept silently. She didn't beg. She knew there was no going back. But she asked, between sobs, if he would ever forgive her. Daniel looked out the window, where the sky was already darkening, and said yes. That forgiveness is the only way to free oneself from the past. But forgiveness isn't the same as accepting it back. It's just moving on. In peace. She got up, grabbed her bag, and paused at the door. Before leaving, she looked at him one last time. And told him she loved him. He smiled. A sad smile. And simply replied, "I know." Then she left. Never to return. But what Daniel didn't yet know, was that betrayal had left its mark on more than one life. Because, days later, a video would surface online. A wedding video. A detail. A familiar face in the back of the church. And that face would change everything. The house fell silent again, and Daniel remained standing by the window, watching the empty street while Helena's words echoed within him with the weight of an avalanche. Night fell slowly, and with it, a different emptiness filled the room. It was no longer pain, nor surprise. It was a kind of ending accompanied by understanding. A kind of bitter liberation. For the first time, he could see Helena clearly. Not the idealized woman he'd loved for years, but the real woman, with her flaws exposed, her impulsive choices, and the trail of loss she left behind. And, strangely serenely, Daniel felt a cycle close, not just with her, but with the version of himself who spent years trying to hold together a sandcastle as the tide rose. The following Monday, while having coffee at a bakery near school, Daniel was surprised by a notification on his phone. A friend had tagged him in a video on social media. The title was simple, even cliché, "Love is in the details." It was a video taken by an amateur videographer during the wedding ceremony of a couple Helena knew. He almost didn't click. But curiosity overcame his disinterest, and when the video started, the images showed the altar, the exchanged vows, the applause, the hugs. It was all ordinary, almost banal. Until the moment the camera made a discreet turn to capture the guests at the back of the church. And it was there, in the last pew, that Daniel saw her. Helena sat, almost hidden among the arrangements. Her eyes were red, her face pale, her body curled up as if she wanted to disappear. But that wasn't what paralyzed him. What left him speechless was the exact moment the bride and groom looked at each other, smiling, and the camera captured Helena's expression. A raw, indescribable pain. It was like watching someone falling apart inside, as if, in that instant, she had realized the true extent of everything she'd lost. Not just Daniel's love. But the respect of others, her own identity, the connection with who she once was. That Helena there was no longer his wife. She was a shattered reflection of the woman who had once held his hand at the altar and promised never to leave him alone. The video went viral among those close to him, and comments soon began. Some in solidarity, others in veiled criticism, but all recognizing that, in that recording, there was more than emotion. There was history. There was truth. Daniel closed his phone and remained silent for a few minutes, staring at the bottom of his cup. Life, he thought, doesn't come around by chance. Everything comes back. And sometimes, it comes back stronger than when it left. During the week, he received a letter hand-delivered by the school secretary. There was no return address on the envelope, but he recognized the handwriting. It was from Helena. The letter was long, handwritten, as if she wanted every word to be read carefully. She didn't ask for forgiveness. Nor did she talk about love. She simply described how she felt watching Daniel move on. She said she envied his silence, the way he seemed to have found peace. She confessed that everywhere she went, even new ones, she missed his gaze, his listening ear, his unfettered touch. And that now, she understood that what she mistook for freedom was simply the absence of responsibility. And that there was no pleasure in feeling free when you lose everything that matters in the process. At the end of the letter was a sentence: "You were the only home I ever had, and I destroyed it all with my own hands." Daniel read it 3 times before tearing the letter into small pieces and throwing them in the trash. Not out of anger, but because he knew that if he kept it, he might cling to memories that no longer belonged to him. And he had learned, the hard way, that love is not a prison. And that forgiving doesn't mean opening the door again to someone who once broke it down. Shortly thereafter, at a school event, Daniel was invited to speak on emotional education for teenagers. He accepted. That day, between talks about empathy, boundaries, and choices, he shared, without naming names, a personal experience that taught him that not all love ends when it dies. Some loves end because they kill themselves. Through neglect, through absence, through lies. And that it takes courage to accept that sometimes loving someone isn't enough. Because love that hurts, that demands silence, that demands without giving, ceases to be love. And becomes an addiction. The audience applauded, some emotionally. But what struck him most was the message he received that night. A mother in the audience wrote, "Thank you. Today I understood why my son no longer looks at me the same way. And I want to do things differently." That message was worth more than any apology he could have received from the woman who hurt him. As the months passed, Helena's presence faded. Mutual friends stopped mentioning her. Her name lost its power. The past became a memory. And, little by little, Daniel found space to start over. Little by little, he began to allow himself something new. Not with haste, nor with urgency. But with presence. With truth. The woman who had previously been just a colleague began to appear more frequently. At first, just coffee and conversations about books. Then, longer laughs, exchanges of confidences, walks at dusk. A bond grew, not on the rubble of an unresolved story, but on the clean ground of someone who knew how to wait for their own time to heal. The first time she entered his house, she noticed there was no longer any trace of Helena there. Everything had been transformed. New paintings, different plants, a new arrangement of furniture. But what caught her attention most was the atmosphere of the house. Light. Serene. No ghosts. No remains. He offered wine. She chose tea. They sat on the porch, and she asked if he still believed in love. He said yes. But now, he would only accept whole loves. He would leave half-loves to those who are content with less. And he was no longer content. In another part of the city, Helena watched from afar. No stalking. No messages. But knowing, through mutual sources, that Daniel had rebuilt his life. And she wept. Not with regret, because she already knew that. But with grief. Mourning for something that didn't die alone. That she killed. She knew there would be no return. That now, it was no longer even part of her memory. It was just the name that couldn't be said. And that, she knew, was the true punishment. Living forever with the certainty that she had held something rare in her hands. And she let it slip away. The last time they crossed paths, months later, was in a supermarket. A quick encounter. A brief glance. She, alone, with a half-empty cart. He, accompanied, his arm draped over the shoulders of the man who now held his peace. When their eyes met, there were no words. Just a subtle nod. And a smile. A smile that said it all. He was fine. She, just existed. And it was there, among shelves of ordinary products, that an extraordinary story finally concluded. Not for the pain it caused, but for the lesson it taught, that love is a choice. And that betraying that choice destroys not only the other person, but also oneself. Because sometimes, forgiveness comes. But return, never again. The encounter at the supermarket was brief, but within it lay the definitive end of everything that had once been a promise. Helena felt the air drain away for a second when Daniel's eyes met hers. There was no anger, no bitterness in that look. But there was absence. And his absence was what hurt her most. It was as if she no longer existed, not even in her memory. As if she had become invisible even in the past. The smile he gave her was kind, respectful, but impersonal. Like someone greeting someone they knew by sight in another life. She stood there, standing in the canned goods aisle, her cart pushed halfway, trying to process what she felt. It wasn't just sadness. It was a kind of emptiness that not even time could fill. The woman beside him seemed light, real, effortless. There was no competition there. Only harmony. And Helena understood, with every cell in her body, that the Daniel she knew no longer existed. And the worst part was that she herself was the one who killed that version of him with every choice she made in secret. After that day, she stopped trying to contact him. Not out of pride, not out of respect. It was simply the recognition of a complete defeat. Of an end with no return. She began to live in silence. She avoided places where they might bump into each other again. She changed her routine, distanced herself from mutual friends, and even isolated herself from her family for a time. She said she needed space to reorganize her life, but the truth was, she felt ashamed to even look at her own reflection. People didn't blame her directly, no one verbally attacked her. But it was in the eyes of others that she perceived the silent judgment, the frustrated expectations of those who had once believed in her, as a woman, as a friend, as someone trustworthy. She lost more than Daniel's love. She lost herself. And living with that absence was crueler than any planned punishment. Meanwhile, Daniel continued his life naturally. He didn't fake happiness, but built it little by little. There was something mature in the way he dealt with the past, as if he had made peace with the pain. The memories still existed, of course, but they no longer ruled his days. They were there like old photographs in a box. You know you shouldn't open them often, because it hurts, but you also don't throw them away, because they're part of who you were. The relationship with Laura, the woman he was with, continued to grow slowly, unhurriedly, but deeply. He didn't talk about Helena, nor did she ask. There was a mutual respect for the silence about what had happened. But Laura sensed, in Daniel's gestures, that there were scars. And so she never forced anything. She was patient, present, whole. And that was enough for him to trust her again. The new relationship didn't come as an anesthetic. It came as a construct. Small discoveries, a new routine that didn't try to imitate the old one. Sundays now had a different smell, a different sound, different recipes. Laura laughed loudly, had a habit of talking to the radio, loved taking pictures of everything, and made a point of holding hands even when no one was looking. Daniel found it strange at first, but then he understood that it was part of what he needed, not a replacement, but a new world where he could breathe without fear. And the more he allowed himself, the more he realized he was still capable of feeling, but in a new way, less dependent, more conscious. The love that was born there wasn't blind passion, it was a lucid choice. And that made all the difference. On the other side of the story, Helena was facing a silent process of reconstruction. Her days were dull, but she constantly tried to stay afloat. She began attending therapy, returned to writing in old notebooks, and reread letters she had written to Daniel in the early years of their marriage. Crying became a nightly ritual, almost like a cleansing of the soul. Many nights, she would lie down to the sound of heavy breathing and wake up with swollen eyes, but with a strange kind of relief that she could still feel something. The hardest part was looking ahead and seeing no one beside her. Her lover had completely disappeared, and even if he returned, she wouldn't allow him to be there. The bitter taste of mutual betrayal was enough to shatter any illusions. There was no affection there. There was escape, vanity, cowardice. Over time, Helena tried to reconnect with some people from her past. One or two friends resisted. Others politely avoided her. The betrayed friend, her lover's wife, never responded to her attempts to contact her again. It was understandable. And fair. Silence is also a way of saying that something has died. And Helena learned to respect this kind of mourning. She knew that asking for forgiveness doesn't always mean being forgiven. And furthermore, that the other person's forgiveness isn't as important as one's own repentance transformed into action. She began to live a simpler life. She left the cultural center and went to work at a small bookstore in the neighborhood. Less glamour, less prestige, but more peace. She began walking alone in the mornings, tending a small vegetable garden on the balcony, and little by little, a different kind of dignity returned to her. Not the old Helena, but a woman who, having fallen so deeply, no longer allowed herself any false steps. Daniel never knew the details of her seclusion. He didn't try to find out, he didn't ask anyone. But sometimes, passing by places you once shared, you allowed yourself a quick thought, a stray memory. Not with longing, but with humanity. He knew he wasn't perfect. He knew that, in some way, he had also become emotionally absent in the final stretch of the relationship. But he learned that nothing justifies betrayal. That mistakes are discussed, faced, but not hidden in other people's beds. What hurt wasn't the fantasy, but the choice. Betrayal begins long before the touch. It begins when someone decides to hide, lie, or leave without warning. And that, for him, was unforgivable. It was at a school event that the past, for a second, knocked on the door again. A former student approached him after the lecture and mentioned, unknowingly, that he had seen Helena at a local bookstore. He said she looked different, but kind as always. Daniel thanked him, smiled, and changed the subject. That night, when he got home, he thought about how everything had changed. And he allowed himself to write something he hadn't done in a long time, a letter. Not to send. But to release. He wrote about the pain, about the love, about the ruins. About the forgiveness he had already given. About the new life. And at the end, he wrote something he had never said out loud: "You taught me to recognize what I never want to experience again." He folded the paper, put it in the drawer, and felt a weight lift from his chest. It was the symbolic end of a story that had already ended long before that supermarket. It was the closing of an emotional cycle. Laura entered the room with 2 coffees and noticed Daniel's distant look. She sat down next to him, handed him the cup, and asked if everything was okay. He looked at her with calm eyes and said yes. That, for the first time in a long time, everything was exactly where it should be. And she smiled. Because she knew he was telling the truth. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Helena was closing the bookstore doors for the day. Alone, she walked to the bus stop and sat down with a book on her lap. A customer had given it to her that afternoon. It was a novel about starting over. She began reading right there, with the yellow light from the street lamp illuminating the pages. And for a moment, she smiled. A small, shy smile, but genuine. Because, even though she had lost everything, there was still something inside her that held on. And that, for now, was enough. But life, in its silent irony, still had one last lesson in store for each of them. And it would come at the least expected moment. Time continued its course with the silent constancy of the hands of an antique clock. Daniel was no longer attached to the past, but something inside him, a kind of silent intuition, still pulsed with a certain restlessness. It wasn't longing, nor pain. It was as if the cycle, though emotionally closed, still awaited one last bend, one last curve that would completely define the road's new direction. The days with Laura remained calm, full, free of tension. It was a light love, effortless to feel. She was a companion in gestures and silence, and Daniel, in turn, reciprocated with spontaneous care, a kind of mature love that didn't need to prove itself to exist. But the tranquility sometimes also carried an echo of what had been, not by comparison, but by the way experiences shape even the way one looks at life. And Daniel, even at peace, still felt that something deep within that story deserved a clearer ending, like a book that closes but leaves a page loose among the others. It was on a Saturday night, during dinner at the house of mutual friends, that a stray phrase brought back a memory that seemed long buried. They were talking about second chances, about people who transform after big mistakes, when a friend mentioned, almost without thinking, that she had seen Helena recently at a reading group at the community center. She said she seemed different, calmer, more introspective. She mentioned that she had read a passage from a book about regret that had moved everyone there. Daniel didn't react immediately. He just listened. But that night, at home, with Laura sleeping beside him, he found himself thinking about what it would be like to see Helena again, not as something pending, but as someone he had once loved and lost. The idea didn't come as a desire. It was simply an almost philosophical need to know where time had taken each of them. So, the following week, he decided to discreetly visit the bookstore where he knew she worked. Not on impulse, but out of a kind of quiet curiosity. He arrived late in the afternoon, slipped in unnoticed, and spent a few minutes observing. She was organizing a shelf in the back. Her hair was tied up unpretentiously, her clothes simple, her face thinner. There was a different silence about her, not the silence of someone fleeing, but of someone who has learned to be with herself. When she saw him, time seemed to skip a beat. She stood still for a second, then straightened and walked toward him with measured steps. He didn't say, "Hi," right away. She stopped a few feet away and, for a few seconds, just stared at him. Then, with a calm but choked voice, she simply said, "You're okay?" He answered yes. And returned the question with the same simplicity. She nodded, unsmiling. She simply held his gaze, as if she needed to say a lot but already knew that no words would be enough. He thanked her for not leaving. He said he just wanted to know if she was truly alive, if she could breathe again after everything. She replied that she hadn't expected to see him, that she didn't know what to say, but that she thought of him often. Not like before, not with desire, but with respect. With an admiration that came too late. Daniel nodded, and for a brief moment, the silence between them carried more weight than any accusation. Then she said she never had the courage to have a relationship again. Not out of guilt, but because she understood that what she lost with him was unrepeatable. It wasn't about romance, it was about trust. About peace. And she confessed that she spent months trying to forgive herself, trying to reconnect with what was still good in her. He said the betrayal was a desperate cry from someone who no longer knew who she was. And that the greatest guilt wasn't betraying him, but betraying everything she believed in. Daniel listened without interrupting. And then he said something he'd never told anyone. He said her betrayal taught him more about love than any other moment in his life. He said he learned that loving also means letting go, recognizing when the love that was once whole has become a fragment. He spent sleepless nights trying to understand where he went wrong, but today he knew it wasn't about mistakes. It was about choices. That everyone has the right to make mistakes, but mistakes come with consequences, and regret isn't always enough to fix them. Helena listened in silence. Her eyes were teary, but firm. She didn't try to argue. She just accepted it. Because it was true. And sometimes, the truth hurts, but it frees. They parted with a brief hug. A light touch from someone who had once loved each other deeply but was now moving down different paths. There were no promises, no questions. Just the understanding that this moment was, finally, the final straw that had been missing. Daniel left the bookstore feeling lighter than when he entered. Not out of revenge, nor vanity. But because he understood, in her eyes, that she was no longer the woman who betrayed him. And he was no longer the betrayed man either. They were two people marked by a history, but finally free from it. In the following days, Daniel returned to his routine with a newfound serenity. He spent more time with Laura, planned a short trip to the coast, and returned to teaching with enthusiasm. He felt whole again. Not because of another person's presence, but because now, everything that was unresolved had found a place. Helena, however, that same week, decided to write for the first time about everything she had experienced. She started a small blog where she talked about new beginnings, about losses that teach, about the weight and value of forgiveness. She didn't expose herself directly, but in each line there was a trace of her story. And, curiously, she began receiving messages from other women who had experienced similar situations. Some who had cheated, others who had been cheated on. All with open wounds. And, for the first time in a long time, Helena felt that her pain could serve something greater than regret. One afternoon, as she was leaving the bookstore, she found a woman sitting on a bench in the square across the street, holding the book she had recommended the week before. The woman recognized her, smiled, and said, "You have a gift. You transform pain into words, and words into hope." Helena thanked her, moved. Not out of pride, but because she felt that, somehow, she could still offer something good to the world, even with all she had lost. Meanwhile, Daniel received an unexpected invitation. Laura surprised him with tickets to a lecture on emotional education, given by an author he'd admired since his youth. He accepted immediately. And it was at this lecture that he heard a phrase that seemed to describe exactly what he'd experienced: "Some people will break you. And yet, they'll be the ones to teach you how to rebuild yourself." As he left the event, he held Laura's hand tighter. And she smiled, as if she knew what was going on inside him. Their reconstruction was neither simultaneous nor proportional. Each forged their own path in their own time. But what united them, even when separated, was the knowledge that the love they once shared had left scars that, now, instead of hurting, taught. The betrayal, though unjustifiable, served as a watershed moment. It transformed them both. And if one was reborn in a new love, the other was reborn in solitude, learning to live with absence and rediscover their own worth. Life, as always, didn't stop. It continued to offer opportunities, encounters, stumbles, and new beginnings. But now, both Daniel and Helena walked with more ease. Because they had faced their shadows, acknowledged their mistakes, and, most importantly, learned not to live imprisoned by them. And without knowing it, they were about to find, each in their own way, the final piece of the puzzle. The one that would bring not only understanding, but true liberation. Years had passed since the end. Life followed the course it usually does when decisions have already been made and the past lost its power to define the next steps. Daniel no longer spoke of Helena, neither in moments of nostalgia nor in confidences. Her name became a silent memory, filed away in a deep corner of his memory where chapters already lived and overcome rest. He and Laura moved to a new, small house, surrounded by trees and natural light, away from the city center, a place where one can hear the sound of one's own thoughts. There they built a different, mature routine, free of demands and empty expectations. It was a relationship based on simple truths and consistent choices. Daniel had become a more introspective man, but with a clearer outlook. He had relearned to trust, not because anyone taught him, but because he chose not to carry grudges that harden the heart. He had understood that you can't control what others do, but you can control what you carry afterward. On a typical Sunday morning, while they were drinking coffee on the porch, Laura called him to show him something on her phone. It was a simple news story, an article about literature and social projects. But at the bottom, in a small note, there was a mention of a blog that had gained national attention for transforming personal experiences into texts that inspired change. The blog belonged to Helena. She had been invited to participate in a radio program, where she would talk about emotional reconstruction and the impact of individual choices on human relationships. Daniel read it carefully. There was no bitterness on her face. Only respect for who she had become. And although he no longer had any desire for closeness, something inside him recognized that, after all, she too had chosen to grow. He closed his phone and returned to the cafe, at peace, weightless. The program aired on a rainy night. Daniel didn't listen, but many who knew him did. And they commented afterward, not with gossip, but with admiration. Helena didn't play the victim, she didn't use words of self-pity. She firmly stated that she had lost the great love of her life through a series of small, daily betrayals, even before the sexual betrayal. He said that betrayal doesn't begin in bed, but with indifference, emotional neglect, and silent lies. And he admitted, in no uncertain terms, that he had destroyed a home with his own hands. He cried live on air. The announcer remained silent for a few seconds after he finished speaking. Then she thanked him, emotionally, saying that it was one of the most sincere interviews she had ever conducted. The impact was enormous. Helena began receiving hundreds of messages. Some were judgmental, others grateful, but most were relatable. They were from people in crumbling relationships, people who had been betrayed and didn't know how to move on, people who had betrayed and carried suffocating guilt. She responded to what she could. She read each one carefully. And, for the first time in many years, she felt that her pain was serving something other than destruction. He never romanticized what he did. Quite the opposite. He turned his experience into a stark mirror so that others could, perhaps, avoid making the same mistake. Despite the recognition, she continued on alone. Not for lack of opportunities, but by choice. She no longer wanted to love halfway, nor offer what she couldn't sustain. One night, walking back from the bookstore, he passed a family sitting in a garden. A father, a mother, and 2 children playing around. The scene was simple, ordinary, but it hurt. Not out of envy, but because she understood that that scenario could have been her destiny, if she had chosen differently. If she had valued the essentials before being seduced by the passenger. She sat on a bench, watching from afar, and let the tears flow unabashedly. It was the final morning for everything he had lost. Daniel, on the other hand, was preparing for a new cycle. After many years in public education, he received an invitation to coordinate a social project aimed at vulnerable youth. He accepted without hesitation. He felt that now, with his life in order, he had more to offer the world. He began giving lectures, mentoring teachers, and writing articles on emotional education. His story, even if not told in all its details, was known to those who needed to hear it most. He had become a model of integrity. Not because he was perfect, but because he had faced and overcome something that destroys many people, the pain of being betrayed, and yet continued to love life. Laura was by his side every step of the way. She never wanted to take Helena's place, never wanted to compare herself. She offered a new love, without demands for healing, just presence. And Daniel, in turn, loved her with the same dedication he once offered the woman who disappointed him, but now with the maturity of someone who understands that love is a daily decision, not an emotional impulse. When they married, they had a simple ceremony, with only their closest friends present. And in their vows, Daniel said a phrase that stuck with everyone present: "Today I promise not to be perfect, but to be whole." And promising that is much more than enough. That same day, when he arrived home after the celebration, he found an envelope in the mailbox with no return address. It was a simple card, with familiar handwriting. It simply said, "I hope that life returns to you in love everything you once gave me and that I failed to honor. You were my greatest gift and my greatest lesson. May you be happy every day." Daniel read it silently, smiled slightly, and placed the note in a box along with other memories. He didn't hold grudges. He held stories. And each one, good or bad, brought him here. Helena attended the wedding via social media, like many others. She didn't cry. She didn't sigh. She just smiled. A sad but sincere smile. She now understood that love isn't just about feeling, it's about caring. And that neglect kills more than anger. She spent the following days immersed in books, writing more frequently, dedicating herself to her support group for women rebuilding their lives. It gradually became a reference not for its fall, but for the way it chose to rise. This story could have ended in pain, but it chose to end in truth. A truth that hurts, yes, but also teaches. Because betrayal doesn't just destroy a relationship. It destroys trust, admiration, the reflection a person had of themselves. It destroys dreams, plans, and anniversaries. It destroys what was built and what will never come to be. There is no romance where there is a lie. There is no future where the present is a deception. Here on this channel, we do not support any kind of betrayal. All the stories told aim to realistically show the devastating impact that selfish choices have on the lives of those who truly love. And now, we want to know, what did you think of this story? Which part touched you most? Have you ever experienced something similar? Comment below, share your opinion, and share your experience. Your voice is important to us. If you've made it this far, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, activate the bell to receive future stories, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Remember, trust is built over time, but destroyed in seconds. Choose wisely. Because those who lose a true love due to betrayal can spend their entire lives trying to fill the void that remains. And they don't always succeed.